General Jean Rapp, 1771 to 1821, was one of Napoleon Bonaparte's most loyal and courageous generals, renowned for both his bravery on the battlefield and his unwavering devotion to the emperor. As one of Napoleon's inner circle, Rapp played key roles not only on the battlefield, but also in diplomatic and administrative efforts. His memoirs remain an essential window into the mindset of the imperial army during its last days and the human cost of France's struggle for dominance in Europe. These are his words. Let's begin. It has been affirmed that Napoleon was not brave, a man who, from the rank of lieutenant of artillery, rose to be the ruler of a nation like France, could not surely be deficient in courage. Of this, his conduct on the 18th Brumaire, on the 5th Nivose, and during the plot of Arena are sufficient proofs, if proofs were wanting. He was well aware how numerous were his enemies among the Jacobins and the Chouans, yet every evening he walked out in the streets of Paris and mingled with the different groups, never accompanied by more than 2 individuals. Lannes, Duroc, Bessières, or some of his aides-de-camp usually attended him in these nocturnal excursions. This fact was well known throughout Paris. The affair of the infernal machine has never been properly understood by the public. The police had intimated to Napoleon that an attempt would be made against his life and cautioned him not to go out. Madame Bonaparte, Mademoiselle Beauharnais, Madame Murat, Lannes, Bessières, the aide-de-camp on duty, and Lieutenant Lebrun, now Duke of Placenza, were all assembled in the saloon, while the first consul was writing in his closet. Haydn's oratorio was to be performed that evening. The ladies were anxious to hear the music, and we also expressed a wish to that effect. The escort picket was ordered out, and Lannes requested that Napoleon would join the party. He consented. His carriage was ready, and he took along with him Bessières and the aide-de-camp on duty. I was directed to attend the ladies. Josephine had received a magnificent shawl from Constantinople, and she that evening wore it for the first time. "Allow me to observe, Madame," said I, "that your shawl is not thrown on with your usual elegance." She good-humouredly begged that I would fold it after the fashion of the Egyptian ladies. While I was engaged in this operation, we heard Napoleon depart. "Come, sister," said Madame Murat, who was impatient to get to the theatre. "Bonaparte is going." We stepped into the carriage. The first consul's equipage had already reached the middle of the Place Carrousel. We drove after it, but we had scarcely entered the place when the machine exploded. Napoleon escaped by a singular chance. Saint-Régent, or his French servant, had stationed himself in the middle of the Rue Nicaise. A grenadier of the escort, supposing he was really what he appeared to be, a water carrier, gave him a few blows with the flat of his sabre and drove him off. The cart was turned round, and the machine exploded between the carriages of Napoleon and Josephine. The ladies shrieked on hearing the report. The carriage windows were broken, and Mademoiselle Beauharnais received a slight hurt on her hand. I alighted and crossed the Rue Nicaise, which was strewed with the bodies of those who had been thrown down, and the fragments of the walls that had been shattered by the explosion. Neither the consul nor any individual of his suite sustained any serious injury. When I entered the theatre, Napoleon was seated in his box, calm and composed, and looking at the audience through his opera glass. Fouché was beside him. "Josephine?" said he, as soon as he observed me. She entered at that moment, and he did not finish his question. "The rascals," said he, very coolly, "wanted to blow me up. Bring me a book of the oratorio." The audience soon learned the danger he had escaped, and they saluted him with testimonies of the deepest interest. These, I think, are unequivocal proofs of courage. The men who have followed him on the field of battle cannot be at a loss to quote many more. Napoleon, whatever his detractors may say, was neither overbearing nor obstinate in his opinions. He was eager to obtain information, and he wished to hear the opinions of all who were entitled to hold any. Among the members of the council, the wish to please him sometimes superseded every other consideration, But when he perceived this, he never failed to restore the discussion to its proper tone. "Gentlemen," he would say to his lieutenants, "I summoned you here, not to bring you over to my opinion, but to let me hear yours. Explain to me your views, and I shall see whether the plans which you propose are better than my own." While we were at Boulogne, he gave a lesson of this kind to the Minister of the Marine. He had proposed some questions, to which M. de Craye replied only by a string of compliments. Napoleon wrote to him thus: "I beg you will send me, in the course of tomorrow, a memorial on the following question. In the present state of affairs, what is most proper to be done? Should Admiral Villeneuve remain at Cadiz? Raise your mind to the importance of present circumstances and the situation in which France and England are placed. Send me no more letters like that which you addressed to me yesterday. They can answer no purpose. I have but one wish, and that is to succeed, for which I pray God, etc." 2 days before the Battle of Austerlitz, a portion of the army was stationed in an unfavorable position, and the general who occupied it exaggerated its disadvantages. However, when the council was assembled, he not only admitted that the position was tenable, but he even promised to defend it. "How is this, Marshal?" said the Grand Duke of Berg. "What has become of the doubts you expressed but a short while ago? What signifies flattering when we have met for the purpose of deliberating?" said Marshal Lannes in his turn. "We must represent things in their true light to the Emperor and leave him to do what he may deem expedient." "You are right," said Napoleon. "Those who wish to win my good graces must not deceive me." But though he was always ready to receive advice from those who were qualified to give it, yet he could not endure remarks made by individuals who might happen to be ignorant of the subject of which they were speaking. Fesch was one day about to make some observations on the Spanish War. He had scarcely uttered 2 words, when Napoleon, leading him to a window, said, "Do you see that star?" It was noon, and the Archbishop replied that he saw none. "Well," said Napoleon, "so long as I am the only one who perceives it, I will pursue my own course, and will hear no reflections on my conduct." On his return from the Russian campaign, he was lamenting, with deep emotion, the death of the many brave men who had been sacrificed, not by Cossack spears, but by the rigors of cold and hunger. A courtier, who wished to throw in his word, said with a very doleful air, "We have indeed sustained a severe loss." "Yes," replied Napoleon, "Madame Barilli is dead." He always sneered at folly, but he never showed himself averse either to pleasantry or frankness. Madame Bacciochi one day brought to the Tuileries her relation, Monsieur Da. She retired after introducing him to the saloon of the household, and he was left alone with me. This Monsieur Daishin, like many of his countrymen, had a very unprepossessing countenance. I was distrustful of him, but nevertheless, I informed the Emperor he was waiting, and he was introduced. He had doubtless something important to communicate. Napoleon, by a motion of his hand, directed me to return to the saloon. I pretended not to observe him, and I remained, for I was apprehensive for his safety. He advanced towards me, and said that they wished to be alone. I then withdrew, but I left the door of the chamber partly open. When Napoleon had dismissed Monsieur Da, he asked me why I had been so reluctant to withdraw. "You know," replied I, "that I am not officious, but I must frankly confess that I do not like your Corsicans." He himself related this anecdote, which displeased some of the individuals of his family. However, I am persuaded that he would rather not have heard me speak of his countrymen in this way. One evening, after the Battle of Wagram, we were playing at Vingt-Étangs. Napoleon was very fond of this game. He used to try to deceive those he was playing with, and was much amused at the tricks he played. He had a great quantity of gold spread out upon the table before him. Rapp, said he. "Are not the Germans very fond of these little Napoleons?" "Yes, sire. They like them much better than the great one." "That, I suppose," said he, "is what you call German frankness." I was at the camp of Boulogne when the Third War with Austria broke out. The French were passing the Rhine. The remnants of the enemy's army, which had been beaten and nearly cut to pieces, shut themselves up in Ulm, and they were immediately summoned to surrender. The account of this negotiation, which was conducted by Monsieur de Ségur, so well portrays the confusion and anxiety of the unfortunate general that I cannot refrain from inserting it here. The following is Monsieur de Ségur's own statement. "Yesterday, the 24th of Vendémiaire, 16th of October, the Emperor desired me to attend him in his closet. He directed me to proceed to Ulm, and to prevail on General Mack to surrender in 5 days, or, if he absolutely required 6, I was to allow him that time. I received no other instructions. The night was dark, a terrible hurricane arose, and the rain poured in torrents. It was necessary to travel by crossroads and to adopt every precaution for avoiding the marshes, in which man, horse, and mission might all have come to an untimely end. I had almost reached the gates of the city without finding any of our advanced parties. All had withdrawn. Sentinels, vedettes, outposts, all had placed themselves under shelter. Even the parks of artillery were abandoned. No fires, no stars were visible. I wandered about for 3 hours before I could find the general. I passed through several villages and interrogated all whom I met, but without receiving any satisfactory answer. At length, I found an artillery trumpeter beneath a caisson, half buried in mud and stiff with cold. We approached the ramparts of Ulm. Our arrival had doubtless been expected, for Monsieur de la Tour, an officer who spoke French very well, presented himself on the first summons. He tied a bandage over my eyes and made me climb over the fortifications. I remarked to my guide that the extreme darkness of the night rendered it unnecessary to blindfold me, but he replied that it was a custom that could not be dispensed with. We seemed to have walked a considerable way. I entered into conversation with my guide. My object was to ascertain what number of troops were shut up in the city. I inquired whether we were far from the residences of General Mack and the Archduke. "They are close at hand," replied my guide. I concluded that all the remains of the Austrian army were in Ulm, and the sequel of the conversation confirmed me in this conjecture. At length, we reached the inn where the general-in-chief resided. He was a tall, elderly man, and the expression of his pallid countenance denoted a lively imagination. His features were disturbed by a feeling of anxiety which he endeavored to conceal. After exchanging a few compliments, I told him my name, and then entering upon the subject of my mission, I informed him that the Emperor had sent me to invite him to surrender and to settle with him the conditions of the capitulation. These words evidently offended him, and at first he seemed disinclined to listen to me further, but I insisted on being heard, and I observed that, having been received, I, as well as the Emperor, might naturally suppose that he knew how to appreciate his condition. But he replied sharply that his situation would soon be changed, as the Russian army was advancing to his assistance, that we should be placed between 2 fires, and it would then be our turn to capitulate. I replied that, situated as he was, it was not surprising he should be ignorant of what was passing in Germany. But I must inform him Marshal Bernadotte was in possession of Ingolstadt and Munich, and that he had his advance posts on the Inn, where the Russians had not yet shown themselves. "May I be the greatest," exclaimed General Mack angrily, "if I am not positively informed that the Russians are at Dachau. Do you think to impose on me thus? Do you take me for a boy? No, Monsieur de Ségur, if I receive not assistance within 8 days, I consent to surrender my fortress, on condition that my troops shall be prisoners of war, and my officers prisoners on parole. 8 days will allow time for affording me assistance, and I shall thus fulfill my duty, but I shall receive aid, I am certain. Allow me to repeat, General, that we are masters not only of Dachau, but of Munich also. Besides, allowing your supposition to be correct, if the Russians be really at Dachau, 5 days will enable them to advance and attack us, and these 5 days His Majesty is willing to grant you. No, sir, replied the Marshal. I demand 8 days. I can listen to no other proposition. I must have 8 days. That period is indispensable to my responsibility. Then, resumed I, the whole difficulty consists in settling the difference between 5 and 8 days. But I cannot conceive why Your Excellency should attach so much importance to this point, seeing that the Emperor is before you at the head of 100,000 men, and that the corps of Marshal Bernadotte and General Marmont are sufficient to retard for 3 days the advance of the Russians, even supposing them to be where they are really very far from being. They are at Dachau, repeated General Mack. Well, Baron, be it so, and even allowing them to be at Augsburg, we should only be the more ready to come to an agreement with you. Do not force us to carry Ulm by assault, for then, instead of waiting 5 days, it will be but a morning's work for the Emperor to gain possession of it. Sir, replied the General-in-Chief, do not imagine that 15,000 men are so easily subdued. The conquest will cost you dear. Perhaps a few hundred men, I replied, while Germany will reproach you with the loss of your army and the destruction of Ulm. In short, with all the horrors of an assault, which His Majesty seeks to prevent by the proposition which he has charged me to make to you. Rather say, exclaimed the Marshal, that it will cost you 10,000 men. The strength of Ulm is known. It consists in the heights which surround it, and which are in our possession. Come, sir, it is impossible that you can be ignorant of the strength of Ulm. Certainly not, Marshal, and I am the better able to appreciate it, now that I am within the walls of the city. Well, sir, resumed the unfortunate general, you see men ready to defend themselves to the utmost extremity, should your emperor refuse to grant them an armistice of 8 days. I can hold out for a considerable time. Ulm contains 3,000 horses, which, rather than surrender, we will eat with as much pleasure as you would were you in our place. 3,000 horses, I exclaimed. Alas, Marshal, you must look forward to dreadful misery before you can think of trusting to so pitiful a resource. The Marshal eagerly assured me that he had provisions for 10 days, but I believed no such thing. Day was beginning to dawn, and the negotiation was no farther advanced than at the commencement of our interview. I might have granted 6 days, but General Mack so obstinately insisted on 8 that I concluded the concession of a single day would be useless. I would not incur the risk, and I rose to depart, saying that my instructions required me to return before daylight, and, in case my proposition should be rejected, to transmit to Marshal Ney the order for commencing the attack. Here, General Mack complained of the conduct of the Marshal towards one of his flags of truce, whose message he had refused to hear. I availed myself of this circumstance to remark that the Marshal's temper was hasty, impetuous, and ungovernable, that he commanded the most numerous corps, and that which was nearest the city, that he impatiently awaited the order to commence the assault, which order I was to transmit to him on my departure from Ulm. The old general, however, was not intimidated. He insisted on being allowed an interval of 8 days, and urged me to make the proposal to the Emperor. Poor General Mack was on the point of signing his own ruin and that of Austria. But notwithstanding his desperate situation, in which he must have suffered the most cruel anxiety, he still refused to yield. He preserved his presence of mind and maintained the dispute in an animated way. He defended the only thing that he could defend, namely, time. he sought to retard the fall of Austria, of which he had himself been the cause, and wished to procure her a few days longer for preparation. When lost himself, he still contended for her. His character, which was political rather than military, led him to exert cunning in opposition to power. He was bewildered amidst a crowd of conjectures. About 9 in the morning of the 25th, I rejoined the Emperor at the Abbey of Elchingen, where I rendered him an account of the negotiation. He appeared quite satisfied, and I left him. He, however, desired me to attend him again, and, finding that I did not come at the very moment, he sent Marshal Berthier to me with a written copy of the propositions which he wished me to induce General Mack to sign immediately. The Emperor granted the Austrian general 8 days, reckoning from the date of the 23rd, the first day of the blockade. Thus their number was in reality reduced to 6, which I might at first have proposed, but which I would not concede. However, in case of obstinate refusal, I was authorized to date the 8 days from the 25th, and thus the Emperor would still have gained a day by the concession. The object was to enter Ulm speedily, in order to augment the glory of the victory by its rapidity, to reach Vienna before the town should recover from the shock or the Russian army could be in a situation to act, and finally, our provisions were beginning to fail us, which was another reason for urging us on. Major General Marshal Berthier intimated to me that he would approach the town, and that if the conditions were agreed on, he should be glad if I would procure his admittance. I returned to Ulm about noon. The precautions which had been observed on my first visit were again repeated, but on this occasion I found General Mack at the gate of the city. I delivered to him the Emperor's ultimatum, and he withdrew to deliberate upon it with several of his generals, among whom I observed the Prince of Liechtenstein and Generals Klenau and Ginley. In about a quarter of an hour he returned and again began to dispute with me respecting the date. He mistook some particular point in the written propositions, and this induced him to believe that he would obtain an armistice of 8 whole days, reckoning from the 25th. In a singular transport of joy, he exclaimed, "Monsieur de Ségur, my dear Monsieur de Ségur, I relied on the Emperor's generosity, and I have not been deceived. Tell Marshal Berthier I respect him. Tell the Emperor that I have only a few trifling observations to make, and that I will sign the propositions you have brought me. But inform His Majesty that Marshal Ney has behaved ill to me, that he has treated me most disrespectfully. Assure the Emperor that I relied on his generosity." Then, with increased warmth of feeling, he added, "Monsieur de Ségur, I value your esteem. I attach importance to the opinion that you may entertain of me. I wish to show you the paper I had signed, for I assure you my determination was fixed." So saying, he unfolded a sheet of paper on which were written these words, 8 days or death. Signed, Mack. I was thunderstruck at the joyful expression which animated his countenance. I was unable to account for the puerile triumph he evinced at so vain a concession. When on the point of sinking, to what a frail twig did the poor general cling, in the hope of preserving his own reputation, the honor of his army, and ensuring the safety of Austria. He took my hand, pressed it cordially, and suffered me to depart from Ulm without being blindfolded. He moreover allowed me to introduce Marshal Berthier into the fortress without the observance of the usual formalities. In short, he appeared perfectly delighted. He started, in the presence of Marshal Berthier, another argument respecting the dates. I explained the mistake that had occurred, and the matter was to be referred to the Emperor. In the morning, the general assured me that he had provisions for 10 days, but I had already intimated to His Majesty that he appeared to have a very short supply, which, indeed, proved to be the case, for that very day he solicited permission to have provision conveyed to the fortress. Mack, on finding that his position was turned, conceived that by throwing himself into Ulm and remaining there, he would draw the Emperor beneath the ramparts, where he hoped to detain him, and thus favor the flight of his other corps in different directions. He thought he had sacrificed himself, and this idea served to uphold his courage. When I entered upon my negotiations with him, he was of opinion that our army was drawn up before Ulm and unable to move. He made the Archduke and Werneck secretly quit the city. One division attempted to escape to Memmingen, another was flying to the mountains of Tyrol. All were either actually made prisoners or were on the point of being taken. On the 27th, General Mack came to see the Emperor at Elchingen. All his illusions had vanished. His Majesty, to convince him of the uselessness of detaining us longer before Ulm, described to him all the horrors of his situation. He assured him of our success on every point, informed him that Werneck's corps, all his artillery, and 8 of his generals had capitulated, that the Archduke himself was in danger, and that no tidings had been received of the Russians. All this intelligence came like a thunderbolt on the general-in-chief. His strength failed him, and he was obliged to support himself against the wall of the apartment. He was overpowered by the weight of his misfortune. He acknowledged the extremity to which he was reduced, and frankly told us that the provisions in Ulm were exhausted. He, however, said that instead of 15,000 men, there were 24,000 fighting men and 3,000 invalids, but that all were plunged into the deepest confusion, and that every moment augmented the dangers of their situation. He added that he was convinced all hope had vanished, and he therefore consented to surrender Ulm on the following day, the 28th, at 3 o'clock. On quitting His Majesty's presence, he saw some of our officers, and I heard him say, "It is mortifying to be disgraced in the estimation of so many brave men." However, I have in my pocket my opinion, written and signed, in which I refused to have my army parcelled out, but I did not command. The Archduke John was there. It is very possible that Mack was obeyed only with reluctance. On the 28th, 33,000 Austrians surrendered themselves prisoners. They defiled before the Emperor. The infantry threw down their arms on the other side of the ditch. The cavalry dismounted, laid down their arms, and delivered up their horses to our cavalry on foot. The troops, while surrendering their arms, shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" Mack was present. He said to the officers, who had addressed him without knowing who he was, "You see before you the unfortunate Mack." I was at Elchingen with Generals Mouton and Bertrand when Mack came to present his respects to Napoleon. "I flatter myself, gentlemen," said he to us as he passed through the saloon of the Aide-de-Camp on duty, "that you do not cease to regard me as a brave man, though I have been obliged to capitulate with a force so considerable. It was difficult to resist the maneuvers of your emperor. His plans have ruined me." Napoleon, who was overjoyed at his success, sent General Bertrand to examine the returns of the army that was in Ulm. He brought intelligence that there were 21,000 men in the city. The emperor could not believe this. "You speak their language," said he to me. "Go and ascertain the truth." I went. I interrogated the commanders of corps, the generals, and the troops, and from the information thus collected, I learned that the garrison contained 26,000 men fit for service. Napoleon, on hearing this, said I was mad and that the thing was impossible. However, when the army defiled before us, its number, as M. de Ségur had stated, amounted to 33,000 men and 19 generals. The cavalry and artillery were superb. That concludes the second part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.